The blizzard hit Bandera, Texas, with such ferocity that Matthew Winchester barely made it to the porch before the world turned white and deadly around him. He stumbled through snow that had no business falling this hard in this part of Texas, his horse whinnying in protest behind him as the wind tore at them both with icy claws. The wooden structure ahead looked like salvation, a sturdy ranch house with smoke curling from its chimney, and Matthew didn't hesitate before pounding on the door with his frozen fist. The door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared, her brown eyes wide with surprise and caution. She was young, maybe 25 at most, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and flour dusting her cheek. Her gaze traveled from his ice-encrusted hat down to his frozen boots, then past him to where his horse stood shivering in the mounting drifts. "Please," Matthew managed through chattering teeth. "My horse and I need shelter. This storm came out of nowhere." The woman's hesitation lasted only a moment before she pulled the door wide. "Get inside, quickly. There's a barn around back for your horse. Can you make it?" Matthew nodded, turning back into the brutal wind. He grabbed his horse's reins and led the animal around the side of the house, following the fence line until he found the barn. His fingers were so numb he could barely work the latch, but he managed to get the door open and lead his horse inside. The barn was well maintained, with 2 other horses already stabled there and fresh hay in the stalls. He quickly unsaddled his mount, rubbed him down as best he could with stiff hands, and made sure the animal had water and feed before stumbling back out into the storm. The journey back to the house felt like miles, though it couldn't have been more than 50 feet. The woman had the door open before he reached it, as if she'd been watching for him. She pulled him inside and shut the door firmly against the howling wind. "Get those wet things off before you catch your death," she said, already moving toward the fireplace where a kettle hung over the flames. "I'll make hot coffee." Matthew's fingers fumbled with the buttons of his coat, his movements clumsy and slow. The woman glanced back at him, seemed to recognize his difficulty, and set down the coffee pot. She approached him with the same cautious look from before, but with determination underneath it. "Let me help," she said quietly. "You're half frozen." "I can manage," Matthew said, but his hands weren't cooperating. "Pride won't keep you from losing fingers to frostbite," she replied, and began efficiently unbuttoning his coat. She helped him shrug out of the heavy garment, then pointed to a chair by the fire. "Sit. Get warm. I'll bring coffee." Matthew sank into the chair gratefully, holding his hands out toward the flames. The heat was almost painful against his frozen skin, but it was a good pain, the kind that meant he'd made it to safety in time. He watched the woman move around the kitchen area with practiced efficiency, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups and bringing one to him. "Thank you," he said, wrapping his hands around the cup and letting the warmth seep into his palms. "My name's Matthew Winchester. I was heading through to San Antonio when the storm hit." "Prudence Carson," she replied, sitting in the chair opposite him with her own cup. "You're lucky you found this place. This storm is unlike anything I've seen in the 5 years I've lived in Texas. The weather's been strange all winter, but nothing like this." "Are you here alone?" Matthew asked, then quickly added, "I don't mean any disrespect, just wondering if there's a mister who'll be coming home to find a stranger in his house." Something flickered across Prudence's face, a shadow of old pain that she quickly concealed. "My husband died 8 months ago, thrown from a horse. It's just me now, running this ranch with the help of 2 hands who live in the bunkhouse. Or who did, until they headed into town 3 days ago for supplies. I hope they had the sense to stay there when the weather turned." "I'm sorry for your loss," Matthew said, and meant it. He could see the grief in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself with a kind of determined strength that spoke of someone who'd had to be strong whether she wanted to or not. "Thank you." Prudence looked toward the window where snow was now completely obscuring the view. "You'll be staying until this clears. No one can travel in this. I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's common sense and basic decency." She stood, moving back toward the kitchen. "I was about to make supper when you arrived. I have beef stew on the stove. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling." Matthew's stomach growled at the mention of food, and Prudence smiled slightly at the sound. It was the first real smile he'd seen on her face, and it transformed her features from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. He found himself smiling back despite his exhaustion, and the cold still clinging to his bones. The storm raged outside as Prudence served up bowls of thick stew with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots swimming in rich gravy. She set a plate of cornbread on the table between them, and they ate in companionable silence for a while, the warmth of the fire and the food gradually thawing Matthew from the inside out. "How long have you been on the trail?" Prudence asked eventually, breaking the silence. 3 months, Matthew replied. "I've been working various ranches between here and Montana, but nothing permanent. Just moving from place to place, taking whatever work comes my way. That sounds lonely." Matthew looked up at her, surprised by her directness. "I suppose it is. But it's been my life for the past 5 years, ever since I lost my family." "Lost them how?" Prudence asked gently. Matthew hadn't talked about this in years. He'd learned early on that his story made people uncomfortable, that they didn't know how to respond to tragedy on that scale. But something about Prudence's open expression, the genuine interest in her eyes, made him want to share. "Cholera outbreak in Kansas," he said quietly. "Wiped out half the town, including my wife and infant daughter. I couldn't stay there after that. Everywhere I looked, I saw them. So I started riding and just never stopped." Prudence reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. The gesture was simple but filled with understanding. "I know that feeling. After James died, I thought about selling this place and going back east to my family, but something kept me here. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was fear of admitting failure. Or maybe it was just that this place still holds pieces of him, and I'm not ready to let those go." They looked at each other across the table, two wounded souls recognizing something familiar in each other's eyes. The wind howled around the house, rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows with a sound like thrown sand. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamp cast a warm glow over the simple but comfortable room. "How old are you, if you don't mind my asking?" Matthew said. 24, Prudence replied. "I married James when I was 19. He was from Pennsylvania originally, came to Texas to make his fortune in cattle. We met when my father brought me out to visit his brother in San Antonio. I thought I was getting an adventure." She smiled sadly. "I suppose I was, just not the kind I imagined. 24 is young to be a widow." 28 is young to be a widower," she countered. "Loss doesn't care about age." Matthew nodded slowly. "That's the truth." They finished their meal and Prudence cleared the dishes, refusing Matthew's offer to help. "You're still recovering from the cold. Just sit and rest." But Matthew couldn't sit still. He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the wall of white beyond the glass. "I've never seen snow like this in Texas. Back in Kansas, sure, but not here." "It's 1874, Prudence said from the kitchen. "Year of strange weather. We had floods in the spring, drought in the summer, and now this. Makes you wonder what the good Lord is thinking." "Maybe he's just testing our endurance," Matthew suggested. "Then I wish he'd decide we've passed already." Prudence came to stand beside him at the window. "My ranch hands took most of the cattle to winter pasture down in the valley before they left. There's only about 30 head up in the near pasture. I need to check on them in the morning, make sure they have access to water and haven't gotten themselves trapped anywhere. I'll help you, Matthew said immediately. You don't have to do that. You're a guest. A guest who's imposing on your hospitality. The least I can do is make myself useful. Prudence studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll accept your help, thank you. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further. Prudence showed Matthew to a small bedroom off the main room. This was meant to be a nursery, she said quietly, standing in the doorway. James wanted children right away, but it never happened. Now I'm grateful for that. At least I don't have a child to raise alone. Matthew heard the lie in her words. She would have loved a child, even alone, because it would have been a piece of her husband. But he didn't call her on it. Everyone had their own way of dealing with grief. It's a good room, he said instead. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Carson. Prudence, she corrected. Given that we're snowed in together, we might as well dispense with formality. Then I'm Matthew. Good night, Matthew. Sleep well. Good night, Prudence. But sleep didn't come easily for Matthew. He lay in the narrow bed, listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about the woman on the other side of the wall. There was something about her that called to him, something beyond her obvious beauty or the natural sympathy he felt for a fellow sufferer of loss. She had a strength to her, a quiet determination that reminded him of his late wife, Sarah. But she was also entirely her own person, and he found himself wanting to know more about her. The morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had picked up, and the snow was now drifting against the house in great waves of white. Matthew woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and found Prudence already dressed and cooking breakfast at the stove. "Good morning," she said, when she saw him emerge from the bedroom. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Matthew lied. "What time is it?" "Nearly 8. I let you sleep in. You looked like you needed it." She gestured to the window. "The storm hasn't let up. We need to check the cattle, but we'll have to be careful. The cold is dangerous, and visibility is nearly zero." They ate quickly, and then bundled up in every warm thing they could find. Prudence produced a heavy coat that had belonged to her husband, and though Matthew felt odd wearing a dead man's clothes, he knew he'd need the extra warmth. They tied a rope between them before venturing out, Prudence's idea to keep from getting separated in the blinding snow. The world outside was alien and hostile. The wind cut through their layers like knives, and the snow was already waist-deep in places. They fought their way toward the near pasture, using the fence line as a guide. The cattle had gathered near a windbreak of trees, huddled together for warmth. Their water trough was frozen solid. Matthew and Prudence took turns breaking the ice with an axe Prudence had brought, clearing enough so the animals could drink. The cattle pressed close, desperate for water, and it took all their strength to keep from being trampled. When they'd finished, they checked each animal as best they could in the blinding conditions, looking for signs of frostbite or injury. One young heifer had wandered away from the herd and gotten herself trapped in a snowdrift. Matthew spotted her while making a circuit of the pasture, just her head and shoulders visible above the white. He called to Prudence, and together they dug her out, their hands going numb even inside their gloves. The heifer was weak and shaking, and it took both of them to get her back to the herd. By the time they made it back to the house, they were both frozen and exhausted. Prudence's lips were blue, and Matthew's face was so numb he couldn't feel it. They stumbled inside and collapsed near the fire, too cold even to remove their wet outer layers at first. "That was foolish," Prudence said through chattering teeth. "We could have died out there." "But we didn't," Matthew replied, "and your cattle are safe for another day." Prudence looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "You're a good man, Matthew Winchester. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's what makes you good." They helped each other out of their wet things, hanging everything near the fire to dry. Prudence made more coffee and they sat close to the flames, slowly thawing out. Matthew found himself studying her profile as she stared into the fire, taking in the curve of her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way firelight turned her hair to burnished copper. "Tell me about your husband," he said suddenly. Prudence turned to him in surprise. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to tell me. What was he like?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "James was ambitious. That's what I remember most about him. He had big dreams for this ranch, plans to build it into something important. He worked himself to exhaustion trying to make those dreams real. Sometimes I think that's what killed him. He was so tired that day, but he insisted on breaking that horse himself. Said he couldn't ask his hands to do something he wouldn't do." She paused, her eyes distant. "He was a good husband. Kind, hardworking, honest. But he was so focused on the future that sometimes I felt like he forgot to live in the present." "Do you miss him?" "Every day. But it's different now. At first, the missing was like a physical wound, something that hurt with every breath. Now it's more like an ache, something I've learned to live with." She looked at Matthew. "What about your wife? What was she like?" "Sarah was gentle," Matthew said slowly, the words coming easier than they had in years. "She had this way of making everything seem okay, even when things were hard. We were farmers, and there were plenty of hard seasons, times when we didn't know if we'd make it through the winter. But Sarah never complained. She'd just smile and say we'd figure it out, and somehow we always did. When our daughter was born, I thought I'd never seen anyone happier." Sarah glowed with it. His voice caught. "She only had 6 months with Elizabeth before the cholera took them both. I couldn't save them. I tried everything, but I couldn't save them." Prudence reached out and took his hand, holding it firmly in both of hers. "It wasn't your fault. You know that, don't you? Knowing it and feeling it are two different things." "Yes," she agreed softly. "They are." They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, staring into the fire. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the house. But inside, in this small circle of warmth and understanding, something was beginning to grow between them. Neither spoke of it. It was too soon, too fragile. But it was there nonetheless, a tentative connection forming between two lonely souls. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of being trapped inside together, of sharing meals and stories, of working side by side to keep the house warm and the cattle alive. They developed a routine. Matthew would wake early and stoke the fire, then make coffee while Prudence dressed. They'd have breakfast together, then bundle up to check on the animals. The rest of the day they'd spend inside, Prudence mending or cooking while Matthew read from the small collection of books she kept, or did repairs around the house that she'd been unable to manage alone. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk. Matthew found himself opening up to Prudence in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. She had a way of listening that made him feel truly heard, and she shared her own stories in return. He learned that she'd been a schoolteacher before marrying James, that she loved reading poetry though she rarely admitted it to anyone, that she was terrified of snakes, but had once killed a rattler with a shovel when it threatened her chickens. "I screamed the whole time," she admitted with a laugh, "but I couldn't let it get my birds." "That's bravery," Matthew said. "Being scared but doing what needs doing anyway." "Is that what you think bravery is?" "That's what I know it is." Anyone who isn't scared is just too foolish to understand the danger. On the 3rd night of the storm, Matthew woke to the sound of crying. He lay still for a moment, trying to place the sound, then realized it was coming from Prudence's room. Without thinking, he got up and crossed the main room, stopping at her closed door. "Prudence," he called softly. "Are you all right?" The crying stopped abruptly. After a moment, her voice came through the door, thick with tears. "I'm fine. Just a bad dream. Go back to bed." But Matthew couldn't do that. He heard the pain in her voice and couldn't walk away from it. "May I come in?" There was a long silence then. "All right." He opened the door slowly. The room was dark except for a shaft of moonlight coming through the window. The storm had finally broken, and stars were visible through gaps in the clouds. Prudence was sitting up in bed, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face wet with tears. "What happened?" Matthew asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "I dreamed about James," she said quietly. "About the day he died. I was in town that day buying supplies. If I'd been home, maybe I could have stopped him from getting on that horse. Maybe I could have convinced him to wait, to rest, to let one of the hands do it." She wiped at her eyes roughly. "It's foolish. I know I couldn't have changed anything. But in the dream, I'm always trying to reach him, to warn him, and I can never get there in time." "I have similar dreams about Sarah and Elizabeth," Matthew admitted. "In mine, I'm searching for the doctor, but the town is a maze and I can't find my way. I run and run, but I never reach him, and when I wake up, they're gone all over again." Prudence looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the moonlight. "Does it ever get easier?" "I don't know. I'll tell you when it does." She almost smiled at that. "Thank you for checking on me." "You're very kind. I'm just being a friend." "Is that what we are? Friends?" Matthew considered the question carefully. What were they? 3 days ago they'd been strangers. Now he felt closer to her than he'd felt to anyone in 5 years. "I'd like to think so, if that's all right with you." "It's more than all right." Prudence reached out and took his hand. "I haven't had a friend in a long time, not a real one. There are people in town I'm cordial with, but no one I can really talk to. Everyone sees me as poor widow Carson, someone to be pitied, but you don't look at me like that." "I don't pity you, I admire you. You're running this ranch alone, surviving, even thriving in some ways. That takes incredible strength." "I don't feel strong. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding on." "That's what strength is, holding on when it would be easier to let go." Prudence squeezed his hand. "You're wise, Matthew Winchester. I'm just old and tired. You're 28, that's hardly old." "I feel old sometimes. I know the feeling." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, still holding hands. Finally, Matthew said, "You should try to sleep. Morning will come early and we'll need to dig out from all this snow. Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep. I don't want to be alone with the dreams right now." Matthew hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course." He sat with her, his back against the headboard while she settled back down under the quilts. She kept hold of his hand and he didn't pull away. Gradually, her breathing deepened and slowed and he knew she'd fallen asleep. But he didn't leave. He stayed there in the moonlight, watching her peaceful face, and felt something shift in his chest. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once, this feeling that was growing inside him. He'd thought he was done with such things, that his heart had died with Sarah and Elizabeth. But here, in this unexpected place with this unexpected woman, it was coming back to life. He must have dozed off eventually because he woke to find morning light streaming through the window and Prudence watching him with soft eyes. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep here." "I'm not sorry. I slept better knowing you were here." She sat up, still holding his hand. The storms passed. They both looked toward the window where blue sky was visible for the first time in days. The world outside was buried in white, but the sun was shining and the wind had finally died. "I should check the cattle," Prudence said, but she didn't move. "Yes," Matthew agreed, but he didn't move either. They looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Prudence leaned forward slowly, giving Matthew plenty of time to pull back if he wanted. He didn't want to. When her lips met his, soft and tentative, he felt something long dormant spring to life inside him. The kiss was gentle, questioning. When they pulled apart, Prudence's cheeks were flushed. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that." "Why not?" "Because you'll be leaving soon. The storm's over. You'll continue on to San Antonio and I'll stay here, and this will just be a moment out of time." "What if I don't want it to be just a moment?" Matthew said, surprising himself with his boldness. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I haven't felt this way in 5 years. I'm saying that being here with you these past few days has made me feel alive again. I'm saying that the thought of riding away from here makes me feel like I'm leaving something important behind." Prudence's eyes searched his face. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're strong and kind and brave. I know you make me laugh and you understand my pain without trying to fix it. I know that when I'm with you I don't feel so alone anymore." "I feel that too," she whispered. "But it's so fast. How can we trust this?" "I don't know, but I know I want to try if you'll let me." Prudence was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with herself. Finally, she said, "Stay, don't go to San Antonio. Stay here and help me with the ranch. Let's see what this is, give it time to grow or fade, just stay." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Matthew pulled her close and kissed her again. Deeper this time, with all the longing and hope that had been building in him over the past 3 days. Prudence responded with equal passion, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for the first time in 5 years, Matthew felt like he was home. They finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, and Prudence laughed shakily. "We should really check those cattle." "Probably," Matthew agreed, but he kissed her once more before standing and pulling her to her feet. They worked together all that day and the next, digging out from the storm. The cattle had survived well, though they'd lost one old steer that had simply frozen during the night. Matthew buried it while Prudence saw to the others. Her ranch hands returned on the second day after the storm, having wisely stayed in town during the worst of it. They were 2 older men, brothers named Earl and Frank, who'd worked for James and had stayed on to help Prudence after his death. "This is Matthew Winchester," Prudence introduced him. "He'll be staying on to help with the ranch." Earl and Frank exchanged glances but didn't comment. They'd clearly noticed the way Prudence and Matthew stood close together, the way they moved in unconscious synchronization, but they were too polite or too wise to say anything. Over the next few weeks, Matthew proved his worth on the ranch. He was a skilled horseman and had a way with cattle that impressed even the taciturn Earl. He fixed the leaning fence posts in the south pasture, repaired the barn roof where winter wind had torn off shingles, and helped move the herd to fresh grazing. More importantly, he made Prudence laugh. He brought lightness back into her life, made her remember that she was young and had a right to happiness. They grew closer with each passing day. Matthew moved his things from the spare room into Prudence's room after the first week, and neither of them felt any shame about it. They were adults, and what they were building together felt right and good. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch even in the cold, wrapped in blankets, talking about their dreams and plans for the future. "I want to expand the herd," Prudence said one night. "James always talked about it, but we never had the capital. Now, with your help and the money I've saved, we could buy some breeding stock in the spring." "We?" Matthew questioned gently. Prudence turned to him, her expression serious. "Yes, we. If you're staying, then this is your ranch too." "I know it's fast, but Matthew, I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that first night when you looked at me like I was a person, not just a tragedy. And every day since has just made me more certain." Matthew's heart swelled. "I love you too." I thought I'd never say those words again, never feel this way again, but you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. A future. A reason to stay in one place instead of running from my ghosts. They kissed in the cold night air, neither noticing the temperature, warmed by the heat between them. When they went inside, Matthew carried Prudence to their bedroom, and they made love with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and amazed. Afterward, lying tangled together under the quilts, Prudence said, "Marry me." Matthew propped himself up on one elbow to look at her. "What? Marry me? I know I'm supposed to wait for you to ask, but I've never been very good at doing what I'm supposed to. I love you and I want to spend my life with you, so marry me, Matthew Winchester." Matthew couldn't help but grin. "You're amazing, you know that. Is that a yes?" "That's an absolutely yes. I'll marry you, Prudence Carson. I'll marry you and spend the rest of my life making you happy. And I'll spend mine making you happy right back." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Bandera. It was a simple ceremony with just a handful of guests, the ranch hands, a few neighbors, and the minister's wife as witness. Prudence wore a dress of deep blue that brought out her eyes, and Matthew wore a new suit he'd purchased in town. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Matthew kissed his bride, he felt tears on his cheeks and didn't care who saw them. The reception was held at the ranch, and though it was small, it was filled with genuine warmth and joy. Earl and Frank had pooled their money to buy the newlyweds a set of silver candlesticks, and one of the neighbor women had made them a beautiful quilt. As the sun set and the guests departed, Matthew and Prudence stood on their porch, his arm around her waist, and looked out over their land. "Happy?" Prudence asked. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," Matthew replied honestly. "You've given me a gift I can never repay." "You've given me the same. We saved each other, Matthew. That storm trapped us together, but what we found was something we both needed. Love in the most unexpected place." "The best kind of love," Prudence agreed. That spring, they bought breeding stock as planned, expanding the herd with quality cattle that would improve their ranch's reputation. Matthew proved to have a good head for business, and between his skills and Prudence's determination, the ranch began to prosper. They worked hard, side by side, building something lasting. By summer, Prudence knew she was pregnant. She told Matthew one evening after supper, her hands shaking slightly with nervous excitement. "Are you sure?" Matthew asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm sure. The doctor in town confirmed it today. We're going to have a baby, Matthew, in February if his calculations are right." Matthew pulled her into his arms and held her tight. He was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. The memory of losing Elizabeth was still a wound that occasionally ached, but he refused to let fear steal this joy from him. "We're going to have a baby," he repeated, testing out the words. "I'm going to be a father again. Are you happy?" "I'm terrified and ecstatic and about a dozen other things all at once. But yes, I'm happy, so very happy." Prudence laughed, her own eyes bright with tears. "Good, because I'm all those things too, and it's nice to know I'm not alone in it." The pregnancy progressed well. Prudence remained healthy and active, continuing to work on the ranch, though Matthew and the hands tried to get her to take it easier. In October, Matthew hired another ranch hand to help with the increased workload, a young man named Pete who was hardworking and eager to learn. Winter came early that year, and as snow began to fall in late January, Matthew couldn't help but remember the storm that had brought him to Prudence's door. "A year ago," he said, watching the snow through the window. "A year ago I was freezing and half dead, pounding on your door." "Best storm I ever lived through," Prudence said from her chair by the fire, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "It brought me you. It brought me home," Matthew corrected. I just didn't know it at the time. The baby came on a cold February night, 2 weeks earlier than expected. The labor was hard and long, and Matthew paced the main room while the doctor and midwife worked with Prudence in the bedroom. Every cry of pain from his wife made him flinch, made him remember Sarah's labor with Elizabeth, made him pray harder than he'd ever prayed that this time would be different. And it was. At dawn, as the sun painted the snow-covered landscape pink and gold, the midwife emerged with a smile on her face. "You have a son, Mr. Winchester, a healthy boy with a good set of lungs." Matthew nearly collapsed with relief. "And Prudence, is she all right?" "She's tired but well. Go see your family." Matthew entered the bedroom to find Prudence propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up at him with so much love in her eyes that he felt his own fill with tears. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Matthew approached the bed carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter this perfect moment. He looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket, at the miniature features and the shock of dark hair, and felt his heart expand in his chest. "He's perfect," Matthew whispered. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking James," Prudence said. "After my first husband, but only if you're comfortable with that. I know it might be strange." Matthew considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Your first husband gave you a home and a life here. In a way, he gave me you. I think it's only right to honor him. James it is." Prudence's eyes filled with tears. "You're a good man, Matthew Winchester. I'm a lucky man. Lucky that a storm trapped me with the woman who would become my whole world." He carefully sat on the bed and put his arm around Prudence, and together they looked down at their son. Little James made small snuffling sounds and waved a tiny fist, and Matthew felt something settle deep in his soul. This was his family now. This was his life. The ghosts of his past would always be part of him, but they no longer haunted him. He'd found his way through grief to joy, through loneliness to love. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under Matthew and Prudence's joint management. They became known throughout the region for the quality of their cattle and the fairness with which they dealt with buyers and workers alike. Young James grew strong and healthy, a bright, curious child who followed his father everywhere and listened raptly to his mother's stories. When James was 3, Prudence had a daughter they named Sarah, after Matthew's first wife. Matthew held his new daughter and wept openly, moved beyond words that Prudence would honor his past in such a way. "Sarah was important to you," Prudence said simply. "She made you the man you are. I want our daughter to carry her name." 2 years later came another son, whom they named Thomas after Prudence's father. And 3 years after that, twin girls they named Emily and Rose. The house that had once been so quiet and lonely was now filled with the noise and chaos of children, with laughter and tears, and the constant motion of young life. Matthew and Prudence grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had their disagreements, as any couple did, but they faced them together with honesty and respect. Matthew never stopped being grateful for the storm that had brought him to Prudence's door, and Prudence never forgot that Matthew had seen her as more than just a widow when he'd first looked into her eyes. On their 10th anniversary, they took a rare evening to themselves, leaving the children in the capable hands of Earl, who'd become something of a beloved uncle to all 5 youngsters. They rode out to a hill overlooking their ranch, the same hill where James Carson was buried under a simple stone marker. "You think he'd be happy?" Matthew asked, looking at the grave. "About us, about what we've built here. I think he'd be grateful," Prudence replied. "He loved this place and he loved me. I think he'd be glad to know that neither was left to fade away, that instead they thrived. I never feel like I'm competing with his memory." "You're not. You're both part of my story, part of who I am. James was my first love and the father of my dreams before they were realized. You're the love of my second chance, the father of my children, the partner of my heart. There's room for both in my history because they're different chapters. Matthew pulled her close. I love you, Prudence Winchester. And I love you, Matthew Winchester. I'm grateful every day for that storm, for your knock on my door, for the courage we both had to open our hearts again. They stayed on the hill until sunset, watching the light fade over their land, over their home, over the life they'd built together from the ashes of their losses. The winter wind was cold, but they were warm, wrapped in each other's arms, wrapped in the knowledge that they'd found something rare and precious. 20 years after that terrible storm, Matthew stood on the same porch where he'd first stumbled, frozen and desperate. He was 48 now, his hair touched with gray, his face lined by years of sun and wind and honest work. Prudence came out to join him, settling into the chair beside his with the ease of long practice. She was 44 and just as beautiful to him as she'd been that first day, maybe more so because now he knew every expression, every gesture, every thought that crossed her face. Their children were grown or nearly so. James, at 20, was running the ranch alongside his father, a skilled cattleman with his mother's determination and his father's steady patience. Sarah, at 17, was teaching at the school in Bandera, following in her mother's footsteps. Thomas, 15, was talking about studying law in San Antonio. The twins, 12, were still deciding what they wanted to do with their lives but seemed inclined toward staying on the ranch. Can you believe it's been 20 years? Prudence asked, taking Matthew's hand as naturally as breathing. Some days it feels like yesterday. Others it feels like a lifetime. It has been a lifetime, a whole beautiful lifetime we've built together. She squeezed his hand. Do you ever regret it? Staying here instead of continuing on to wherever you were going? Not for a single moment. This is where I was meant to be. I just didn't know it until a storm forced me to your door. Maybe it wasn't just the storm. Maybe it was something bigger. Fate, destiny, God's plan, whatever you want to call it. Maybe, Matthew agreed. All I know is that I'm grateful. For the storm, for your kindness to a stranger, for the love we found. I'm grateful for every day I've spent with you. Prudence leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm grateful too. You gave me back my life, Matthew. After James died, I was just existing, going through the motions. But you reminded me what it felt like to truly live. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over their land, over their life, over the love story that had begun with a desperate knock on a door during a winter storm. Inside the house, they could hear their children moving about, preparing supper, arguing over something trivial, laughing at some shared joke. It was the sound of home, of family, of everything they'd built together. That night, lying in bed with Prudence curled against his side, Matthew thought about the journey that had brought him here. From Kansas to Texas, from loss to love, from loneliness to a house full of family. It hadn't been an easy road, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. What are you thinking about? Prudence asked sleepily. About how lost I was before I found you. About how a lonely cowboy and a grieving widow found warmth in the middle of a winter storm, and how that warmth grew into a lifetime of love. Prudence smiled against his chest. That's quite poetic for a cowboy. I learned from the best. You've made me better in every way, Prudence. Better man, better father, better human being. You did the same for me. She lifted her head to look at him in the moonlight. I love you, Matthew Winchester. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Prudence Winchester, always and forever. They kissed, a gentle meeting of lips that still held passion after all these years and settled into sleep wrapped in each other's arms. Outside, the Texas night was clear and cold, stars glittering like diamonds in the vast sky. But inside, the house was warm with the love of a family built from the ashes of loss, warmed by the unexpected gift of second chances. The ranch continued to thrive. Matthew and James worked together to expand their holdings, buying neighboring land when it became available, always reinvesting in better stock and better infrastructure. They became one of the most successful ranches in the region, known not just for their cattle but for the way they treated their workers and their neighbors. Prudence opened a small school on the ranch for the children of their workers and nearby families who couldn't easily reach the town school. She taught 3 days a week, passing on her love of learning to a new generation. Sarah often helped her, and it became clear that teaching was the young woman's calling. As the years continued to pass, Matthew and Prudence became pillars of the Bandra community. They donated money to build a new church and helped fund a hospital. They gave young people their starts in ranching, lending money without interest to those who needed it and mentoring those who sought their advice. They remembered what it was like to need help, to be alone and struggling, and they made sure no one in their community had to face those struggles without support. Their children grew and built lives of their own. James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and they gave Matthew and Prudence their first grandchild, a boy they named Matthew after his grandfather. Sarah married the new doctor in town, and they had 3 children of their own. Thomas did go to law school and set up practice in San Antonio, though he came home often to visit. The twins both stayed on the ranch, Emily eventually taking over the bookkeeping and financial management, while Rose focused on horse breeding. On their 30th anniversary, the family threw a huge celebration. Children and grandchildren, friends and neighbors, workers current and past all came together to honor the couple whose love story had become something of a legend in the area. Earl and Frank, both retired but still living in the bunkhouse they'd called home for decades, gave a rambling toast about the day they'd come back from town to find a stranger on the ranch, and realized within days that he was exactly what their boss lady needed. As the party wound down and guests began to drift away, Matthew and Prudence found themselves once again on their porch, looking out over the land they'd built together. 30 years, Matthew said wonderingly. 30 years since I knocked on your door half frozen and desperate. Best knock I ever answered, Prudence replied, taking his hand. Her fingers were marked with age now, but her grip was still strong. We've had a good life, haven't we? The best. Better than I ever imagined possible. Any regrets? Not a single one. You. Only that James Carson didn't live to see what became of this place. He would have been proud. I think he knows, Matthew said softly, and I think he is proud. Proud of you, proud of what you built, proud that you didn't let grief destroy you. Prudence squeezed his hand. Thank you for that. For never being threatened by my past, by my first love. Not every man would have been so generous. Your past made you who you are. I love all of you, including the parts that were shaped by someone else. They sat until the stars came out, until the last guest had departed, and their children and grandchildren had settled into the various rooms of the now much expanded house. The family that had started with a lonely cowboy and a grieving widow now encompassed dozens of lives, all connected by the love that had bloomed in the wake of a winter storm. Matthew lived to be 72 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, Prudence beside him as she'd been for 44 years. His last words to her had been, "Thank you for answering the door." Prudence lived another 5 years after Matthew's death. She stayed active on the ranch, watching her grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the storm that had brought him into her life, about the love they'd shared. She made sure they understood that love could come when you least expected it, that second chances were real, that loss didn't have to be the end of happiness. When she died at 73, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her last conscious thought was of two things: James Carson, who'd given her her first chance at love, and Matthew Winchester, who'd given her her second. She'd been blessed twice, loved twice, and she'd loved fully both times. As her eyes closed for the last time, she could have sworn she felt two hands reaching for hers, and she took them both gladly as she stepped into whatever came next. They buried Prudence next to Matthew in the family plot on the hill, overlooking the ranch, not far from where James Carson had been laid to rest all those decades ago. At the funeral, young Matthew, now a man of 42 running the ranch with his own children, gave a eulogy that brought tears to every eye. "My grandparents taught us all something important," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "They taught us that love is stronger than loss, that hope can survive the darkest winters, that two broken people can heal each other and build something beautiful. They showed us that family isn't just about blood. It's about the bonds we choose to forge and the commitment to honor them every single day. This ranch, this family, this community we're all part of stands as a testament to the love between a lonely cowboy and a grieving widow who found each other in a storm." He paused, looking out over the land his grandparents had built, now thriving under the care of the fourth generation. "They would want us to remember not their deaths but their lives. To remember the laughter and the love, the hard work and the rewards it brought. To remember that every day is a gift, every person we love is a treasure, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected circumstances." As the crowd dispersed, the family lingered. James and his wife, Sarah and her husband, Thomas and his family down from San Antonio, the twins and their children. They stood together, united by the legacy of love that Matthew and Prudence had created. They really did love each other, didn't they? One of the great-grandchildren asked, a girl of maybe 10. "More than anything," James replied, "right up until the very end. Will I love someone like that someday, if you're lucky, yes, and if you're brave enough to open your heart even when it's scary." The family eventually left the hilltop, returning to the ranch house where life would continue as it always had. The cattle still needed tending, the horses still needed feeding, the business of ranching still demanded attention. But it would all continue, generation after generation, built on the foundation that a lonely cowboy and a widow had laid during and after a terrible winter storm. Years passed. The ranch stayed in the family, growing and changing with the times but always holding true to the values Matthew and Prudence had instilled. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The porch where Matthew had first knocked became a sacred space, preserved and maintained even as the rest of the house was modernized. And every winter, when the first snow fell, whatever Winchester was currently running the ranch would stand on that porch and look out at the white landscape and remember. Remember that love could come from the most unexpected places. Remember that loss didn't have to be forever. Remember that two lonely people had found each other and built something that would last long after they were gone. The winter storms came and went, as they always had and always would. But none would ever be as important as that one storm in 1874, the storm that had trapped a lonely cowboy and a grieving widow together and given them both a second chance at happiness, at love, at life. In the warmth they'd found in each other, They'd created a legacy that would warm generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of love, courage, and hope. Their story became more than just family history. It became a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest times, warmth could be found. That sometimes the storms we fear are actually bringing us exactly what we need. That opening the door to a stranger might mean opening your heart to love. And that two people who'd lost everything could find everything they needed in each other. The Winchester Ranch thrived for over 150 years, each generation honoring the one before while making the place their own. And every single person who ever lived there, worked there, or visited there knew the story of Matthew and Prudence, the lonely cowboy and the widow who'd found unexpected warmth in the middle of a winter storm and built a love story for the ages. Their legacy wasn't just the land or the cattle or the family name. It was the proof that love could survive loss, that hope could outlast grief, that two broken people could heal each other and create something beautiful. It was the knowledge that sometimes the best things in life come when you're brave enough to open the door, even in the middle of a storm, and trust that what's on the other side might be exactly what you need. And so the story ended as all the best love stories do, not with death but with life continuing, with love multiplying across generations, with the warmth of two hearts found in a winter storm spreading out to warm countless others. Matthew and Prudence Winchester had found each other in the most unexpected way, loved each other completely, and left behind a legacy that would never be forgotten. Their love had been a light in the darkness, a warmth in the cold, and a hope that would inspire their descendants for generations to come.